Welcome to this journey through one of the most chilling and unexplained cases ever documented in the American South. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We are interested to know how far these documented accounts reach and at what moments of day or night they find their listeners. In the deep south of the United States, in the sweltering summer of 1853, in a place where cotton grew tall and human suffering grew taller still, there lived a boy whose story would become whispered legend, passed down through generations in hushed voices, a tale so disturbing that even those who witnessed it struggled to speak of it without trembling. This is not a story of hope or redemption in any conventional sense. This is a chronicle of something darker, something that dwells in the spaces between cruelty and consequence, between the visible world and the shadows that move just beyond our perception. This is the story of a boy who was considered worthless, who was humiliated beyond endurance, and of the something dark that happened when human cruelty finally pushed too far against forces it did not understand. What you are about to hear has been pieced together from plantation records, personal diaries, medical accounts, and testimonies collected over more than a century. Fragments of truth so disturbing that many who possessed them chose to hide them away, to pretend they did not exist, to deny what they had witnessed with their own eyes. The Hartwell plantation stood in northern Alabama near the town of Huntsville, sprawling across more than 6,000 acres of fertile river-bottom land. The plantation house itself was a monument to wealth extracted from human suffering. A grand structure of white columns and sweeping verandas surrounded by gardens maintained with obsessive care while those who maintained them lived in conditions barely fit for animals. The master of this plantation was Nathaniel Hartwell, a man of 48 years whose cruelty was legendary, even in a time and place where cruelty was commonplace. Hartwell was not cruel from ignorance or from the brutality of circumstance. He was cruel from choice, from pleasure, from a deep-seated need to demonstrate his power over others, to see them broken and diminished, to feed something dark within himself that demanded constant suffering from those he controlled. Hartwell had inherited the plantation from his father in 1840, and in the 13 years since, he had transformed it from a merely profitable enterprise into one of the most productive in Alabama, achieving this through methods so harsh that neighboring planters, themselves no strangers to brutality, sometimes expressed discomfort at his techniques. But Hartwell did not care about the opinions of his neighbors. He cared only about profit, about power, and about the satisfaction he derived from absolute dominion over the 237 human beings he claimed as property. Among those 237 souls was a boy who had been born on the plantation in the spring of 1841, the son of a woman named Rachel, who worked in the fields, and a father whose identity was never recorded, perhaps never known. The boy was given the name Samuel, though Hartwell rarely used it, preferring instead a variety of degrading epithets that emphasized what he perceived as the boy's worthlessness. From the earliest age, Samuel was marked as different, as somehow less than the other children on the plantation. He was small for his age, thin and frail-looking, with limbs that seemed too delicate for the heavy work demanded of even the youngest workers. He was quiet, speaking rarely, moving through the world with a silence that some found unsettling. He had a tendency to stare, to fix his gaze on things or people for long periods without blinking, without apparent thought, as though his mind was somewhere else entirely, while his eyes remained focused on the physical world. Martha Collins, who had been enslaved on the Hartwell plantation and who was interviewed in 1897 at age 68, recalled Samuel from his early years. That boy was different from the start. Not wrong exactly, not sick or simple like some said, but different. He didn't play like the other children. Didn't laugh much. Didn't cry neither, even when he had reason to. He'd just watch everything with those big dark eyes, taking it all in, storing it up somewhere inside himself. My mama, she said Samuel had old eyes, said he looked at the world like he'd seen it all before and wasn't impressed. She said some people are born with their souls already tired, already knowing too much. She said Samuel was one of those. Nathaniel Hartwell took a particular dislike to Samuel from the time the boy was old enough to be assigned work around age 7. Perhaps it was Samuel's silence that offended him, the boy's refusal to show fear or pain in ways Hartwell found satisfying. Perhaps it was something in Samuel's gaze, that steady, unblinking stare that seemed to look through rather than at him. Whatever the reason, Hartwell made Samuel the special target of his cruelty, using the boy as an example, as a demonstration of his absolute power as entertainment for himself and his guests. By the time Samuel reached 12 years of age in 1853, he had become Hartwell's primary victim, the focus of systematic humiliation that went far beyond the terrible norm of the plantation. Hartwell would summon Samuel to the main house or to the fields where other workers could see, and he would force the boy to attempt tasks that were impossible for someone of his size and strength, then mock him viciously when he inevitably failed. A diary entry from Hartwell himself, dated March 15, 1853, reveals his attitude. Spent a most amusing afternoon demonstrating the inherent inferiority of the Negro race to visiting colleagues from Georgia. Had the small boy Samuel attempt to lift a full barrel of flour naturally impossible for someone of his puny stature. When he failed after several attempts, I explained to my guests that this exemplifies the fundamental weakness of character and constitution that marks his kind, as suited only for the most menial tasks under constant supervision. The boy showed no emotion whatsoever during this demonstration, which I find both convenient and somewhat disturbing. A normal creature would show shame or distress. This one simply stares with those vacant eyes as though nothing has occurred. But Samuel's eyes were not vacant. They were watchful, recording, remembering. And something was building behind them. Something that grew with each humiliation, each cruelty, each moment of degradation inflicted not just on him, but on everyone around him. Thomas Morrison, who served as overseer on the Hartwell plantation until March 1853 when he abruptly quit despite the excellent wages, left a letter that was discovered among his effects after his death in 1889. The letter, never sent to its intended recipient, described his reasons for leaving. I can no longer remain in Mr. Hartwell's employ despite the financial sacrifice this decision entails. I have witnessed and participated in practices common to plantation management, practices I am not proud of, but which I believed were necessary for maintaining order and productivity. But what Mr. Hartwell does to that boy Samuel goes beyond necessity, beyond discipline into something darker. He takes pleasure from the boy's suffering in a way that disturbs me deeply. More disturbing still is the boy himself. He never reacts, never cries or begs or shows any normal human response to mistreatment. He simply watches with those eyes that seem to see everything, to judge everything, to record everything for some future accounting. I have begun to dream about those eyes, to see them watching me, even when the boy is nowhere near. I must leave before something terrible happens. I feel it coming like a storm on the horizon, and I do not wish to be present when it arrives. Morrison's replacement was a man named Jacob Thornton, younger and harder, someone who saw no problem with Hartwell's methods, who in fact admired them as efficient means of maintaining absolute control. Thornton encouraged Hartwell's treatment of Samuel, even suggested new forms of humiliation, new ways to break the boy's strange composure and extract some visible sign of suffering or submission. In May 1853, the humiliations intensified. Hartwell began making Samuel's degradation a regular entertainment, inviting guests to witness and participate in mocking the boy. He would have Samuel brought to the main house in the evenings, would force him to stand in the dining room while Hartwell and his guests ate elaborate meals, would make him watch while they consumed food he was forbidden to touch, would throw scraps on the floor and order him to eat like a dog while they laughed. Sarah Hartwell, Nathaniel's wife, recorded her discomfort with these practices in her private journal, discovered in 1952 when the old Hartwell house was being renovated. I find my husband's treatment of the boy Samuel increasingly disturbing, though I dare not speak against it openly. Nathaniel has always been firm in his management of the slaves, but his focus on this particular child seems excessive, almost obsessive. He spends hours devising new humiliations, new ways to demonstrate the boy's supposed worthlessness. What troubles me most is not just the cruelty itself, but the boy's response or lack thereof. He endures everything with a blank expression, never crying, never pleading, simply existing in a state of apparent disconnection from what is being done to him. But his eyes, those dark, bottomless eyes, never leave my husband's face. He watches Nathaniel constantly, and I have begun to feel that he is not merely a victim observing his tormentor, but something else, something waiting, something biding its time. I have tried to mention this to Nathaniel, but he dismisses my concerns as womanish sentiment. Perhaps he is right. Perhaps I'm simply unnerved by the boy's strangeness. But I cannot shake the feeling that something terrible is building, that my husband is pushing against something that will eventually push back. Throughout that spring and into the summer of 1853, Other enslaved people on the plantation noticed changes in Samuel. Subtle shifts that filled them with unease mixed with something that might have been hope or might have been fear. Elijah Thompson, interviewed in 1901 at age 74, who had been 15 years old in 1853 and worked in the stables, recalled, "Samuel was always quiet, always different. But that summer, he became something else. It was like he was fading out of the world, becoming less solid, somehow less present. He'd be standing right next to you, and you'd forget he was there, then suddenly notice him and jump because you hadn't realized. And his shadow, Lord have mercy, his shadow wasn't right. It was darker than it should be, thicker somehow, and sometimes it seemed to move when he wasn't moving. Seemed to stretch and reach in ways shadows shouldn't. We started avoiding him when we could. Not because we didn't care about him, but because being near him made you feel things, made you sense something gathering around him, like storm clouds gathering before thunder." The animals on the plantation reacted to Samuel's presence with increasing agitation. Horses would rear and refuse to approach when he came near. Dogs would whimper and hide. Even the chickens and pigs would become restless and disturbed when he passed. Birds would fall silent when he walked beneath trees, creating pockets of unnatural quiet in his wake. Dr. Henry Carver, the physician who attended to the Hartwell family and occasionally examined enslaved workers when they were too valuable to lose, was called to observe Samuel in June 1853 after several overseers expressed concern about the boy's unnatural demeanor. His medical notes preserved in the archives of the Alabama Medical Society are revealing examined the Negro boy Samuel at Mr. Hartwell's request. Physically, the child appears severely undernourished and shows evidence of repeated physical abuse, though nothing that would prevent him from performing light duties. His pulse is unusually slow, approximately 40 beats per minute, which would normally indicate a serious cardiac condition. Yet, the boy shows no signs of fatigue or weakness. His body temperature reads consistently at 96 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees below normal. Yet, he shows no signs of hypothermia. Most peculiar is his psychological state. The boy is unresponsive to questioning, staring straight ahead without acknowledgement. However, I do not believe he is simple-minded or deaf. Rather, he appears to be present in body, but absent in mind, as though his consciousness has retreated to some interior space beyond reach. When I moved my hand rapidly toward his face to test his reflexes, he did not flinch. But I observed something disturbing. The shadows in the room seemed to darken momentarily, and I felt a sudden coldness that made me step back involuntarily. I told Mr. Hartwell that the boy appears physically fit for work, but I privately believe something is deeply wrong with him, something beyond my medical understanding. I recommend he be watched carefully, though I cannot articulate the nature of the threat I sense. On July 12, 1853, an incident occurred that should have served as a warning of what was to come. Hartwell had organized an evening entertainment for visiting planters from Mississippi. And as part of the program, he had Samuel brought to the main house to perform what he called demonstrations of natural inferiority. The boy was forced to attempt reading from a book, knowing he would fail, as he had never been taught letters. He was forced to solve simple arithmetic problems he had no knowledge of. He was forced to answer questions about history and geography he could not possibly know. And with each failure, Hartwell and his guests laughed, made jokes, used Samuel's inability as proof of the racial theories they used to justify their entire social system. Throughout this humiliation, Samuel stood silent and still, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance. But those who were present, both white and black, reported that the atmosphere in the room changed as the evening progressed. The air became heavy, oppressive, difficult to breathe. The temperature dropped noticeably despite the summer heat. The lamps flickered, though there was no breeze, and shadows seemed to gather in the corners of the room, growing darker and thicker, pressing inward. One of the visiting planters, Richard Blackwood from Natchez, wrote about the evening in a letter to his brother, dated July 15, 1853. Attended an evening at Nathaniel Hartwell's plantation that left me deeply unsettled. Hartwell has a particular Negro boy he uses for demonstrations, a strange, silent creature with eyes that seem to look through you rather than at you. The treatment Hartwell subjects this child to goes beyond firm management into something that feels wrong, blasphemous, even, though I hesitate to use such a word. As the evening progressed, and Hartwell continued his humiliations, I began to feel increasingly uncomfortable, not just morally, but physically. The room felt wrong somehow, the air too thick, the shadows too dark, the silence between laughs too deep. And the boy standing there enduring everything began to seem not like a victim, but like something else, something waiting, something gathering strength from each indignity inflicted upon him. By the end of the evening, I was eager to leave, and I noticed others felt the same, though no one spoke of it. We made our excuses and departed earlier than planned. I have no intention of returning to the Hartwell plantation. Something is wrong there. Something that makes my skin crawl and my instincts scream danger, though I cannot explain what or why. But the final incident, the event that would become the center of legend and whispered stories for generations, occurred on the night of August 3, 1853 during a gathering of overseers and guests at the main house. The evening had been hot and oppressive, the air thick with humidity that seemed to press down like a physical weight. Nathaniel Hartwell was in an expansive mood, having recently learned that his cotton yields would exceed previous years by a substantial margin. He decided to celebrate with his overseers and several neighboring planters. And as part of the entertainment, he ordered Samuel brought to the house for what he promised would be his most amusing demonstration yet. Samuel was brought to the dining room where the men had gathered after dinner, drinking whiskey and smoking cigars. The boy stood in the center of the room, small and thin, his clothes ragged, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on nothing. Hartwell announced that he would demonstrate the ultimate proof of his absolute power, the complete dominion of master over slave, by forcing the boy to publicly humiliate himself in ways so degrading that even his hardened audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. What exactly? Hartwell demanded. The testimonies vary, and many refused to specify, but all agreed. It was beyond any previous cruelty, designed not just to humiliate, but to utterly destroy any shred of human dignity the boy might still possess. For the first time in anyone's memory, Samuel reacted. He did not speak. He did not move. But he raised his eyes from the floor and looked directly at Nathaniel Hartwell. Truly looked at him, and something in that gaze made every person in the room feel a sudden chill despite the oppressive heat. What happened next was witnessed by 13 people, all of whom would later give consistent accounts, despite having every reason to deny or distort what they had seen. The lamps in the room began to flicker, flames dancing wildly, though there was no wind, no draft, no physical explanation for their movement. The temperature dropped precipitously, breath becoming visible in the air, frost forming on the windows in the middle of August. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move, to writhe and twist, to stretch toward the center where Samuel stood, as though drawn to him, as though he was pulling them toward himself. And behind Samuel, emerging from the darkness, shadows began to take form. They were not clear, not solid, but suggestion more than substance. Human-shaped darkness that seemed to crowd around the boy. Dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, pressing close, watching with eyes that were not eyes, but points of deeper darkness in the shadow forms. Nathaniel Hartwell, who moments before had been laughing and cruel, fell to his knees, his face suddenly pale, his eyes wide with terror. His mouth opened as though to scream, but no sound emerged. His hands clutched at his chest, and those close enough reported that he seemed unable to breathe, gasping like a fish pulled from water, fighting for air that would not come. The other men in the room reacted with panic. Some ran for the door, fleeing into the night. Others pressed themselves against the walls as far from Samuel as the room would allow. Several fell to their knees in prayer, calling out to God for protection from what they were witnessing. Jacob Thornton, the overseer, grabbed his whip with shaking hands and raised it toward Samuel, shouting at him to stop, to cease whatever witchcraft he was performing. But as the whip descended, it simply fell from his hands, dropping to the floor as though it had become too heavy to hold. Thornton staggered backward, his face contorted with fear, and fled from the room. Throughout all of this, Samuel stood motionless, his eyes locked on Hartwell, his expression unchanged. He did not speak. He did not threaten. Clear his throat, he did not move. He simply watched as Nathaniel Hartwell experienced whatever he was experiencing. Some private terror that no one else could fully see, but that was devastating enough to reduce a powerful, cruel man to a gasping, trembling wreck on the floor. After what witnesses estimated as 5 to 10 minutes, though time seemed distorted in that room, the phenomena began to subside. The temperature slowly returned to normal. The shadows retreated to their proper places. The lamps steadied their flames, and Samuel, still without speaking, turned and walked from the room, moving through the men who pressed themselves against the walls to avoid his touch, walking with steady steps out of the house and into the night. Nathaniel Hartwell remained on the floor for nearly an hour, unable or unwilling to move. When he finally spoke, his first words were a whispered denial. "I saw nothing. Nothing happened. It was the heat, the whiskey. Nothing happened." But his hands continued to shake for the rest of that night and for days after, and those who had known him as confident and cruel found him changed into someone fearful and uncertain. Dr. Carver was summoned to examine Hartwell the following morning. His private notes record found Mr. Hartwell in a state of extreme agitation and distress. "Physically, I can find nothing wrong. His heart is sound, his lungs clear, his pulse strong. Yet he is clearly traumatized by something, jumping at shadows, refusing to be alone, insisting that lamps remain lit even during daylight hours." When I asked what had occurred, he would only say, "The boy showed me. He showed me everything. Everyone I've hurt, everything I've done. They were all there watching me, waiting for me. And he just stood there letting me see them, letting them see me." I asked if he meant the Negro boy, Samuel, and he became extremely agitated, begging me not to speak the name. He claimed that speaking the name might summon the boy might bring back what he had witnessed. "I am at a loss, Mr. Hartwell appears to have experienced some form of severe psychological episode, but I have no explanation for its cause beyond the testimonies of others present. Testimonies that describe impossible things I cannot credit as real, yet cannot dismiss, given the number and consistency of the witnesses." The other men who had been present that night scattered to their homes and plantations, and within days, stories began to spread through the region. Whispered accounts of the night when something dark had manifested in the Hartwell plantation house, when shadows had moved with purpose, when a small, humiliated boy had somehow brought a powerful man to his knees without laying a hand on him, without speaking a word, simply by looking at him with eyes that held something no one could name, but everyone feared. In the days following August 3rd, Samuel disappeared from the plantation. No one saw him leave. No one tracked him. There was no search, no pursuit, no attempt to recover Hartwell's property. It was as though everyone, including Hartwell himself, was relieved by his absence, grateful that whatever he carried with him had departed, that the oppressive presence that had gathered around him was gone. Enslaved people on the plantation whispered that Samuel had walked into the swamp and simply dissolved into shadow, becoming part of the darkness he had always seemed connected to. Others claimed he had been taken by the spirits that had gathered around him, claimed by ancestors or forces older than names. Some said he lived still in the deep places, in the forgotten corners, watching and waiting. Hartwell never recovered his former confidence or cruelty. He stopped the public humiliations, reduced the severity of punishments, seemed diminished and uncertain where he had once been confident and brutal. He took to drinking heavily, spending long hours in his study alone, sometimes heard talking to himself or to presences no one else could see. Sarah Hartwell wrote in her journal on August 10, 1853, "My husband is destroyed, though he lives and moves and speaks. Whatever occurred that night broke something in him that cannot be repaired. He flinches at shadows, insists all lamps remain lit, refuses to be alone. He mutters about eyes watching him, about debts that must be paid, about judgments waiting. I asked him to tell me what he saw, what truly happened in that room. But he only wept and said, 'The boy showed me truth. He showed me what I am, what I've done, what's waiting for me when I die. And I cannot unsee it. I cannot unknow it. I am already in hell. And death will only make it permanent. I'm frightened for him and for myself. The house feels different now. Colder, darker, as though something changed that night that cannot be changed back.' Within a year, Hartwell was dead. The official cause was listed as heart failure. But those who tended him in his final month spoke of a man who had lost the will to live, who seemed to be fleeing from something no one else could see, whose final words were, 'They're here. All of them. Everyone I hurt. They're here to take me where I belong. The Hartwell plantation continued under Sarah's management for several years, but the story of that August night had spread too widely, had become too infamous. Potential overseers refused employment. Neighboring planters avoided social contact. Enslaved people whispered that the place was cursed, that shadows moved wrong there, that Samuel's presence lingered even in his absence. The plantation was eventually sold in 1858, and the new owners, unaware of the full history, attempted to restore it to profitability. But they too reported strange phenomena. Shadows that moved independently of any light source, cold spots that persisted even in summer, the sense of being watched by unseen eyes, animals that refused to enter certain areas, and a small figure barely glimpsed in. Peripheral vision, standing in corners or at the edges of fields, watching with dark, bottomless eyes before vanishing when looked at directly. The Civil War brought chaos and transformation to the region. And in the confusion of those years, the old Hartwell plantation house burned to the ground under circumstances never fully explained. Some said it was arson by Union troops. Others claimed it was enslaved people taking revenge on a hated symbol of their oppression. But some whispered that the fire started from within, from shadows that finally consumed the structure that had housed so much cruelty. After the war, during the period when formerly enslaved people were interviewed by researchers attempting to preserve their testimonies, several accounts of Samuel emerged, each adding details to the legend. Esther Williams, interviewed in 1903 at age 78, who had been a girl of 8 in 1853, said, "I remember Samuel. He was different from all of us. Like he wasn't completely in this world. Like part of him was always somewhere else, somewhere dark where we couldn't follow. After that night, after what happened to Mr. Hartwell, Samuel just disappeared. But people said they saw him sometimes in the swamps, in the deep woods, standing at crossroads at night. They said he was gathering others like him, other children who'd been hurt too much, and teaching them to call the shadows to summon what he'd summoned. They said wherever cruelty lived, Samuel might appear, might stand silent and watching, might bring with him the darkness that makes cruel men remember their sins. I don't know if any of that's true, but I know what I felt the few times I saw Samuel before he left. I felt like I was standing next to something powerful, something old, something that had decided to wear the shape of a hurt child for purposes of its own. And I was glad he was on our side, or at least not against us, because whatever he was, it was something you didn't want angry at you." Moses Washington, interviewed in 1897 at age 69, who had been 16 in 1853, provided a different perspective. "That night changed everything on that plantation. Before it was hell, pure hell, with Mr. Hartwell being as cruel as any man could be. After it was different. Mr. Hartwell was broken. His overseers were scared. And those of us who'd been under the whip found we could breathe a little easier. Samuel did that. I don't know how. Don't claim to understand it. But he did something to Mr. Hartwell that night that broke his power, broke his will to hurt us. In that sense, Samuel saved us. Even if the way he did it was something none of us fully understood or wanted to understand. He showed us that even the most powerless among us might carry something that the powerful should fear. And maybe that's the real lesson. That cruelty has consequences. That pushing someone too far might wake something that can't be controlled or predicted. That there are debts that come due in ways we never expect. As decades passed, the story of Samuel took on the quality of legend passed down through families, embellished in some tellings, minimized in others, but never forgotten. In certain communities, particularly among descendants of enslaved people, Samuel became a kind of dark folk hero, a symbol of resistance that took a form no one expected, a reminder that power has limits and cruelty has costs. But there were also reports, impossible to verify, but persistent over time, of a figure matching Samuel's description appearing at places where cruelty occurred, where the powerless were being abused, where violence was being inflicted on those who could not defend themselves. These accounts came from across the South, spanning decades. Describing a boy who never aged, who watched silently as wrongs were committed, whose presence preceded inexplicable incidents, where abusers experienced sudden terror, where cruel men fell to their knees gasping, where shadows moved with purpose and showed terrible visions to those whose consciences made them vulnerable. Were these accounts of the same Samuel somehow persisting across decades, across death itself? Were they copycat stories inspired by the original legend? Were they something else entirely? A form that suffering takes when it reaches a critical mass, a shadow that emerges wherever cruelty becomes intolerable. No one knows. The testimonies exist, scattered through archives and family histories, consistent enough to demand attention, but impossible to prove. In 1923, a historian named Elizabeth Morgan published a controversial article examining the Samuel legend and attempting to separate fact from folklore. Her conclusion was measured but haunting. Something certainly occurred at the Hartwell plantation on August 3, 1853. Too many witnesses, too many consistent details, too many documented consequences for it to be entirely fabricated. A boy named Samuel existed. He was subjected to extraordinary cruelty. Something happened that night that terrified multiple witnesses and fundamentally changed Nathaniel Hartwell's personality and behavior. Beyond these facts, we enter speculation. Did Samuel possess supernatural abilities? Did he summon spirits or shadows? Or did he simply, through some combination of will and circumstance, create a mass psychological experience that manifested in ways the witnesses interpreted as supernatural? I cannot answer definitively. What I can say is that the story of Samuel serves a purpose for the communities that preserve it. It offers a narrative of resistance in a context where resistance seemed impossible. A story of power emerging from powerlessness, of consequences for cruelty, of justice manifesting in unexpected ways. Whether Samuel was a real person with genuine supernatural abilities or a symbolic figure representing collective hope for justice, the power of his story remains. It reminds us that pushing human beings beyond endurance might awaken something we cannot predict or control. That treating others as less than human might reveal our own inhumanity in ways that cannot be denied. That what we do in darkness might be brought to light in forms we never imagined. Perhaps the final word should belong to a testimony given in 1932 by a woman named Grace Foster, who was 106 years old and who claimed to have been a young woman on a neighboring plantation in 1853. Her account was recorded by a WPA researcher and filed away in archives where it remained largely unknown until recently. I was 21 years old when Samuel did what he did at the Hartwell place. News traveled through our community fast. Both the white folks' version and our version, and they didn't match. White folk said the boy had used conjure, had called up demons, had committed some kind of blasphemy. Our people said different. They said Samuel hadn't called anything. They said what happened was simply truth becoming visible. They said Samuel had been hurt so much, humiliated so deeply, pushed so far past what a human soul should have to endure that something in him broke open. And what was inside him all along finally showed itself. They said it wasn't demons or spirits or magic. They said it was memory made solid, pain made visible, consequences made manifest. They said, Mr. Hartwell looked at Samuel that night and finally for the first time really saw him. Saw him as human. Saw all the pain he'd inflicted. Saw it reflected back from Samuel's eyes like a mirror that couldn't be denied or ignored. And that seeing destroyed him because he couldn't live with the truth of what he'd done. I asked my grandmother what she thought Samuel really was. And she told me something I never forgot. She said, "Baby, that boy was hurt until he became something else, something that pain made, something that suffering shaped into a form we don't have proper names for. He was human, but he was also more than human. Or maybe he was exactly human. And that's more terrible and powerful than we like to think. He showed us that there are limits to what people can do to each other before something breaks. And when that breaking happens, what comes through the cracks might be something that makes the whole world hold its breath." And so the story of the enslaved boy who was considered useless, who was humiliated beyond endurance by his master, who was pushed to the breaking point and beyond, ends with questions rather than answers, with mystery rather than certainty. Something dark happened on that August night in 1853. Something that multiple witnesses described consistently. Something that changed lives and altered the course of events. Something that has echoed through the generations in stories and warnings and glimpses of a small figure watching from shadows. Was Samuel a real boy with supernatural abilities? Was he a symbol that communities created to make sense of suffering? Was he something that suffering itself created, a form that trauma takes when it becomes unbearable? Was he human or something else, or exactly human? And that's what makes the story so disturbing. The answer perhaps doesn't matter as much as what the story tells us. It tells us that cruelty has consequences. That pushing human beings past their breaking point might release something that cannot be controlled. That treating others as worthless and humiliating them without mercy might awaken forces that make the perpetrators face exactly what they've done, reflected back in ways that destroy them. It tells us that power has limits. That dominion over others is never as absolute as it appears. That in the space between the powerful and the powerless, in the shadows where suffering accumulates, something might be growing that will eventually demand accounting. It tells us that the smallest among us, the most victimized, the most humiliated, might carry within them something that makes the mighty tremble. Not because of strength or weapons or conventional resistance, but because of something deeper, something that dwells in the human soul or perhaps beyond it. Something that emerges when cruelty finally goes too far. The boy named Samuel, whether he was exactly who the stories say he was, or something more symbolic, more mythic, represents a truth that every society built on cruelty eventually learns. That what we do to the weakest among us does not disappear into nothing. That suffering accumulates, that debts come due, that consequences manifest in ways we never expect. And on certain nights, in certain places where cruelty once flourished or still flourishes, people report seeing a small figure standing in shadows, watching with dark, unfathomable eyes, silent and still, bringing with it a coldness that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the chill of recognition, the ice-cold understanding. That we are seen, we are known, and what we have done is remembered. The humiliation ended that night in August 1853. The boy who was called worthless proved his worth in ways his tormentor could never have anticipated. And the something dark that happened was not an invasion from outside, not a curse or a demon, but simply truth becoming visible. Consequences becoming unavoidable. Justice manifesting in a form no one expected, but everyone recognized once they saw it. That is the story. That is the legend. That is the warning. And whether you believe it happened exactly as described or whether you take it as symbolic truth expressed through narrative, the message remains the same. Push too far, hurt too much, humiliate without mercy. And you might discover that even the smallest and weakest among us carries within them something that can bring the mighty to their knees. Something that can make shadows move. Something that can show you exactly what you are and leave you gasping with the unbearable weight of that knowledge. Samuel was considered useless. Samuel was humiliated. And then something dark happened and nothing was ever the same again.